This is the revision video for Unit 1, Topic 8, Extreme Environments. The hot arid environment can be found between the equator and the Tropic of Cancer, including many countries in the Sahel region just south of the Sahara Desert. Malawi, just south of the equator, is another example of a hot arid environment that we use as our main case study. The temperature in the hot arid environment is long hot summers, average monthly temperatures frequently above 30 degrees centigrade and never below 15 degrees centigrade. In terms of the rainfall, it is extremely dry, often less than 500 millimeters per year. Most precipitation is through heavy and short rainstorms. There is no winter in the hot arid region, and there is very low variability in the weather, although periods of extreme drought do occur, and some dust storms and rainstorms are occasionally occurring. The polar environment is located at the North Pole and is within the Arctic Circle and includes countries such as Greenland, northern Canada, Alaska and Russia. The temperature in the polar environment is an average of often below zero and never above 10 degrees centigrade. Winter months can average between -20 and -30 degrees centigrade. The polar biome is also dry. There's often less than 300 millimeters of rainfall per year, and most precipitation is rainfall. The term extreme environment tells us that both the hot arid and the polar environment are extremely difficult for both plants and humans and animals to survive in. This results in both flora and fauna having incredible adaptations. First of all, we are going to look at the polar region in more detail. The polar bear has several incredible adaptations. It has hollow and transparent fur that allows it to reflect the white snow, making it fantastic insulation and also excellent camouflage when hunting. Furthermore, the polar bear has thick blubber to help it keep warm, and it has big furry feet with claws to help it walk on the snow. The Arctic willow has extremely shallow roots to allow it to get the small amounts of water that result in melting snow. It has incredibly small leaves that stop it from evaporating and stop it from transpiring too much of its water. It also has spiky leaves to stop other animals from eating it, and it's very low to the ground and looks like a cushion which keeps it warm in winter storms. Resources in both extreme environments are extremely scarce. That means there's not many of them. In the polar environment, this results in several adaptations that humans have made to survive in this environment. Firstly, the Inuit people often are very, very short and stocky, allowing them to keep warm and conserve heat. To this day, they wear traditional clothing made out of seal skins and polar bear and fox fur that keeps them as warm as possible. Farming is not possible in polar regions, resulting in polar Inuit people and indigenous people to hunt animals. They hunt seals and they hunt large fish such as sharks. They also hunt whales. The food that they catch can then either be frozen or salted to preserve it for the months where hunting will be more difficult. The Inuit are also adapted to diets based upon protein and not vitamin C and vitamin D, fruit and vegetables. They get much of their vitamin D from the rare minke whale which they hunt, and there's a great deal of vitamin D in the skin which helps them to survive the lack of sunlight in the polar region. Housing and design have incredible design features that allow them to survive the polar environment. Houses have steep roofs which allow snow to fall off and not build up and become too heavy. The windows are small, reducing heat loss. They have thick insulation in their walls, and they also build their houses on stilts to keep them off the permafrost and help keep them warm. In terms of transport in the polar region, the traditional method of transport is of course husky dog and sled. Other than that, large trucks will be used to transport raw materials such as oil and gas from the Arctic regions into North America. Energy consumption is incredibly high in the polar region, obviously because it's extremely cold. A lot of polar people get their energy from oil, which you can find under the sea ice, and although this oil is usually quite expensive, it's relatively cheap for those polar people. Pipelines are built on stilts to keep it off the permafrost to stop the pipes from freezing. In terms of cultural uniqueness, Inuit people are nomadic. They move as herds of caribou move between the winter and summer regions and living in different types of houses. They live in igloos in winter and portable tents made of animal hides and skins in the summer. Traditionally, Inuits share the food that they have hunted, and everyone does his or her part to help those in need. It's a real community effort. The ceremonies surrounding their hunting of whale and seals obviously form a massive part of their cultural uniqueness. Most societies are tribal with no central leadership, and they often live in remote bands. The threat to the lifestyles of the indigenous people in the polar region has increased a great deal during the last 50 years, partly due to climate change and partly due to the increased accessibility of the polar regions, bringing in tourism and industry. One of the greatest threats is the outmigration of the indigenous Inuit people. In the Arctic, there are jobs in the oil, gas, and mining industries, but the work is physically hard and the high pay cannot compensate for the isolation and lack of social opportunities. The movement of Western industries, such as the oil industry, into the Arctic and polar region has resulted in much cultural dilution. Nomadicism has declined, diets have changed, and old storytelling traditions have been lost. Alcohol has often had a very damaging effect on community. Oil, gas, and ore drilling and mining have changed much of the Arctic landscape in Alaska and Siberia. The wilderness is crisscrossed by roads and pipelines, disrupting animal migration routes, having a massive environmental impact. The greatest threat to the polar extreme environment is the threat of climate change. Warmer temperatures, milder, shorter winters, and more storms characterize the effects of this climate change. You can see in this photograph, taken from a satellite, around about 50% of the polar sea ice has been melted from the period of 1979 to 2007, having a massive impact on the habitats of the plants and animals that live in the polar biome. This also has a massive impact on the people. Traditional hunting lifestyles undermined and prey becomes more scarce, diets have to change. Migration to urban areas as traditions disappear and communities split up. There is also a huge threat to coastal communities. Many coastal communities are having to migrate inland to areas of higher ground, resulting in loss of their cultural traditional practices. How can people living in the extreme environments, such as the polar environment, adapt to the changing climate? In the polar region, tourism is becoming a significant feature of Inuit people adapting to the polar environment. They can provide tourists with an extremely accurate experience, showing them lots of different wildlife that would currently be found in the extreme environment. This, of course, provides people in the Inuits with a new source of income, but more tourists could mean more damage to the environment through litter, air pollution, and new buildings. As the permafrost melts, road transport will become more difficult as roads subside and buckle. Air transport is an alternative, but of course is very polluting. What are the role of global actions in protecting extreme environments such as the polar environment? The 1997 Kyoto Summit tried to reach an agreement to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, the USA didn't sign, and although China and India signed, they were not assigned targets. This conference is often considered by many people a failure because of its lack of action. You can see that this cartoon here represents what the Kyoto Protocol perhaps actually means. The Arctic Council is an intergovernmental group made up of 8 Arctic nations and 6 indigenous peoples' organisations, and it was set up in 1996. The Arctic Council is also considered by many to be a failure because it put forward no binding recommendations with no enforcement. Without a change in attitude of some of the greatest global nations of USA, India and China, it's very unlikely that global actions will have any impact on the polar environment. Hence, focusing the importance on local actions such as sustainable tourism are incredibly important. Our example of a hot arid country is Malawi in Africa, which is found slightly south of the Sahel region of Africa, south of the equator. There are of course flora adaptations in this region. The cactus is a prime example of a plant that has been adapted extremely well to its location in the hot arid environment. It has thick waxy skin which stops it from losing water, has large fleshy stems in order to store lots of water. It has spikes which protects it from animals who may try and eat it to get water. And it has low, widespread roots so that when it rains hard, which is characteristic of the hot, arid environment, it can collect as much water as possible, much like an upside-down umbrella. The camel is also extremely well adapted to the hot, arid environment, and it represents our fauna adaptation. They have extremely long eyelashes and slit nostrils which protect them from blowing sand. They have wide feet which allows them to walk on the sand easily, and they of course have huge humps that allow them to store lots of water. How have people adapted to the hot, arid environment? Many indigenous people, such as the Maasai people shown here, are tall and slender, allowing them to lose as much heat as possible. The clothing that they wear is loose and light, allowing them to keep cool in the hot summer months. Traditionally, people in the Sahel and in Malawi plant their food in large pits. They then fill these pits with soil to absorb as much water as possible when it does rain, stopping the water from flowing away. They are also outstanding at knowing which bugs and other wildlife that they can eat at times of year when food is scarce. Camels are still used as a mode of transport in the African Sahel region and in Malawi as well. These camels are used because they are fantastic, of course, at storing water and not needing much food or fuel. The houses have thick mud walls which keep the residents that live inside them cool. The walls are of course very easily repairable because they're made of mud. They have flat roofs which can be used to collect rainfall when it does rain. They also have very small windows to keep the heat out. Water butts to collect the rainfall, and solar panels to use the sun's energy are modern adaptations that humans in the hot arid environment have made. Cultural uniqueness in the hot arid region can be represented by some of the fishing festivals that happen in Mali at the end of a very, very dry season, such as shown in this picture here. Furthermore, many of the North African and the Sahel region African people in the hot arid region have become outstanding at conserving and rerouting water so that it can be used on their farms and to feed and water their families. Many people living in the Sahel region have also become excellent astronomers, allowing them to travel at night when temperatures are much cooler. Women also have a very high status in many of the countries in the Sahel region, where they own their own family property, livestock, and are often literate. Of course, in the hot arid region, one of the major threats to people and the natural systems is outmigration. In the Sahel, subsistence farming is affected by drought. Basic human needs like food and clean water are often not met, so people migrate if they can. Much of the land in the Sahel region has been overgrazed, and this can often lead to the land becoming desertified. And you can see the spreading deserts in Africa are an extremely large problem. Of course, the hot arid region is under threat from climate change as well. Lower rainfall and higher temperatures are the main impact of climate change in the Sahel region and in all hot arid regions around the world. The impact on the natural systems is increased desertification and erosion of topsoil, more heavy rainstorms causing flooding and landslides, species of plant and animal are forced to migrate, and there are disruption to traditional grazing and breeding areas. There are of course an increased number of dust storms as well. There is also an impact on traditional economies. The increased frequency of drought and famine and falling human health due to malnutrition. Forced migration to find grazing land as traditional areas turn to deserts. And of course rural to urban migration because of falling food and water supply. The main problem of the hot arid environment is a lack of water. And WaterAid is one charity that provides water for people in some of the driest hot arid regions on the planet, providing intermediate technology. Hand pumps, which are a form of intermediate technology, are very, very cheap to build. They service a local community. They're easy to fix and can be fixed by local people, providing an excellent source of water for a local community. Rainwater harvesting is another form of intermediate technology developed by WaterAid. Houses collect rainwater and put them into a water tank, which can then be used on farmers' crops and land. The Kyoto Summit and the Copenhagen Conference of 1997 and 2009 also have been a failure for the hot arid region. The United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification has also failed and had little success in stopping the spread of deserts around the world.